They seized power through force, fear, and manipulation. They ruled over millions, silenced dissent with imprisonment and death, and built their names into monuments of terror. But every dictator, no matter how untouchable they seemed, eventually fell. Some died in luxury, others were dragged from hiding holes and torn apart by the very people they oppressed. This is how history's most feared rulers met the ends they never saw coming. Mao Zedong. For decades, Mao Zedong stood as the undisputed emperor of the world's most populous nation. The man who founded the People's Republic of China in 1949 and engineered policies that led to the deaths of tens of millions through famine, forced labor, and political purges, died in a hospital bed in Beijing on September 9, 1976, at 82 years old. But the final years of his reign told a different story than the godlike image he projected. By the early 1970s, Mao's health was in rapid decline. He suffered from amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS, a degenerative neurological disease that slowly robbed him of speech and movement. He also battled heart disease and lung problems, largely from decades of chain smoking. The man who once swam across the Yangtze River to demonstrate his vigor could no longer walk unaided. His inner circle worked frantically to hide this from the Chinese public. State photographs were carefully selected, his few public appearances staged. When foreign dignitaries visited in his final years, they were often alarmed. Mao could barely speak, slumping in his chair while aides interpreted his slurred words. On September 9, 1976, Mao's heart gave out. He was pronounced dead at 12 minutes past midnight. The announcement shook the world. Within weeks, the faction known as the Gang of Four, including his own wife, was arrested and put on trial. The era of the Cultural Revolution, with all its bloodshed and chaos, was officially over. Mao's body was embalmed and placed in a crystal coffin inside a mausoleum at Tiananmen Square, where it remains on public display to this day, a choice that carries a bitter irony. The man who destroyed China's ancient culture and traditions became, in death, a kind of relic himself. He was never tried, never toppled, and never truly held accountable. He simply deteriorated and died, while the system he built outlasted him. Idi Amin. Idi Amin ruled Uganda with a combination of paranoia, brutality, and theatrical self-promotion that was almost unbelievable. He declared himself His Excellency, President for Life, Field Marshal Alhaji Dr. Idi Amin Dada, conqueror of the British Empire. Under his 8-year reign from 1971 to 1979, an estimated 100,000 to 500,000 Ugandans were tortured, killed, or disappeared. But unlike many of history's monsters, Idi Amin escaped justice entirely, and he managed to do it in style. When Tanzanian forces and Ugandan exiles invaded in 1979 and dismantled his regime, Amin fled first to Libya, then to Iraq, and finally settled into a comfortable life in Jeddah, Saudi Arabia, where he was quietly given asylum and a generous monthly allowance by the Saudi government. For over 2 decades, he lived in a luxury apartment complex, drove expensive cars, reportedly spent time at the pool and attended mosque, and showed absolutely no remorse for anything he had done. Saudi Arabia refused all extradition requests. Uganda had no power to reach him, and so Amin simply lived, fat, comfortable, and free. In July 2003, Amin slipped into a coma from kidney failure in a Jeddah hospital. His family reportedly flew in and pleaded with him to show remorse for his crimes so that he could return to Uganda. According to those present, he never did. He died on August 16, 2003, at approximately 78 years old. His body was buried quietly in Saudi Arabia. No trial, no accountability, no justice. One of Africa's most brutal dictators died peacefully, and the world barely flinched. Francisco Franco. Francisco Franco defied the pattern of most dictators. He was never overthrown, never assassinated, never dragged from a bunker. He ruled Spain from 1939, after winning a bloody civil war, until his death 36 years later. He outlasted Hitler. He outlasted Mussolini. He outlasted Stalin. And when he finally died, he did so slowly, stubbornly, while an entire medical establishment tried desperately to keep him alive. By 1975, Franco was 82 years old, and his body was failing spectacularly. He suffered from Parkinson's disease, heart disease, kidney failure, peritonitis, and a lung infection, all at the same time. By October of that year, he had been moved to a hospital in Madrid where doctors performed operation after operation, reportedly against his own wishes to be allowed to die. The medical team's desperation to keep him alive was itself political. The Spanish establishment didn't know what would come next and wanted more time to prepare. The result was grotesque. An elderly man being resuscitated multiple times, tubes running through his body, machines breathing for him, while the country waited. Franco himself reportedly said, "How hard it is to die," in his final days. He died on November 20th, 1975. He was buried in a massive stone mausoleum called the Valley of the Fallen, which he had built using the forced labor of political prisoners. In 2019, after years of debate, the Spanish government exhumed his remains and reburied him in a private family tomb, finally stripping him of the monument he had built for himself. Muammar Gaddafi. For 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi ruled Libya with such bizarre, paranoid flamboyance that he seemed almost impossible to take seriously, until you remembered the mass graves, the state-sponsored terrorism, and the political opponents murdered in their homes. He slept in a Bedouin tent, even at state events. He traveled with a female bodyguard unit. He wrote philosophy books. He rambled for hours at the United Nations. And then, in 2011, the Arab Spring arrived, and everything unraveled. As rebel forces swept across Libya with NATO air support, Gaddafi's loyalists fell city by city. Gaddafi himself retreated to his hometown of Sirte. On October 20th, a NATO airstrike destroyed his convoy as it attempted to flee. Gaddafi survived the strike and scrambled into a concrete drainage pipe with a small group of bodyguards. When rebel fighters found him, they dragged him out into daylight. Multiple phones recorded what happened next. A bloodied, disoriented Gaddafi, the man who had once called himself the King of Kings of Africa, was shoved, beaten, and paraded through the streets. In one video, he's heard pleading, asking what he had done wrong. Rebel fighters jeered around him. What happened in the minutes that followed is still disputed. But Gaddafi was shot, reportedly in the head, and died shortly after capture. He was 69. His body was taken to Misrata, placed in a commercial meat locker, and displayed publicly for 4 days. Libyans lined up to photograph it. His burial location was kept secret. The man who had lived in tents as theater died in a drainage ditch for real. Pol Pot. If any dictator in modern history represents the full horror of ideological fanaticism, it is Pol Pot. Between 1975 and 1979, his Khmer Rouge regime turned Cambodia into a killing field. Cities were emptied, intellectuals were executed, entire ethnic groups were targeted. Up to 2 million people, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population, died from execution, starvation, overwork, and disease. Pol Pot called it Year Zero. When the Vietnamese invaded in 1979, the Khmer Rouge was dismantled and Pol Pot fled into the jungle near the Thai border. For nearly 2 decades, he simply continued to live there. By the 1990s, the Khmer Rouge was fragmenting. In 1997, Pol Pot ordered the execution of a senior Khmer Rouge figure he suspected of betrayal, killing the man along with his entire family. His own commanders, horrified, placed him under house arrest in the jungle. In April 1998, word came that the remaining Khmer Rouge leadership had agreed to hand Pol Pot over to an international tribunal. Instead, on April 15th, Pol Pot was found dead in his bed. He was 73. The stated cause was heart failure. The timing was deeply suspicious to many investigators. The Khmer Rouge allowed journalists to photograph and film his body, proof, they said, that he was really gone. He was cremated on a pyre of tires and wood in the jungle. An ugly, careless end for a man who had murdered 2 million people and was never once made to answer for it. Saddam Hussein. In December 2003, American soldiers found Saddam Hussein at the bottom of a hole, a narrow, dirt-walled pit beneath a farmhouse near Tikrit, barely big enough to lie down in. The man who had gassed entire Kurdish villages, invaded 2 neighboring countries, and tortured political opponents in industrial-scale prisons, was found disheveled, with a long, gray beard, clutching $750,000 in cash. "I am the president of Iraq," he reportedly said. "I want to negotiate." There were no negotiations. Saddam was tried by an Iraqi special tribunal for the 1982 massacre of 148 Shia men and boys in the village of Dujail. The trial lasted over a year, and Saddam used every session as theater, interrupting, dismissing the court's legitimacy, going on hunger strikes. The verdict, guilty. Sentence, death by hanging. On December 30th, 2006, before dawn, Saddam was brought to a former military intelligence facility in Baghdad. As he stood on the gallows, a noose around his neck, guards began taunting him with sectarian slogans. Someone in the room had a cell phone. Saddam responded with prayers and a defiant expression. The trapdoor opened. The grainy video leaked online within hours. Saddam, composed to the end, was dead at 69. His body was returned to Tikrit and buried in his hometown. The execution sparked immediate controversy, not over whether he deserved to die, but over the chaotic, undignified manner in which it was carried out. Augusto Pinochet came to power on September 11, 1973, through a military coup that bombed the presidential palace in Santiago and overthrew the democratically elected Salvador Allende. In the years that followed, his regime tortured more than 28,000 people, killed or disappeared over 3,000 others, and sent hundreds of thousands into exile. And yet, when the end came for Pinochet, it came in a hospital bed, at 91 years old, surrounded by family, without ever spending a single day in prison. The closest the world came to justice was in October 1998, when Pinochet traveled to London for surgery. Spanish Judge Baltasar Garzón issued an international arrest warrant for crimes against humanity, and British police detained him in his hospital room. For 503 days, Pinochet remained under house arrest in a Surrey mansion while governments argued over his fate. In the end, he was released on medical grounds and returned to Chile. Back home, dozens of criminal cases awaited him. His lawyers repeatedly argued he was too sick and senile to stand trial. The cases dragged on for years, and none reached a verdict. On December 3, 2006, he suffered a massive heart attack. Complications mounted rapidly over the following week. On December 10th, International Human Rights Day, Augusto Pinochet died at Santiago's military hospital. When news broke, Santiago split. Some poured into the streets to celebrate, others gathered to mourn. He was cremated, and his ashes were divided among family members. He died as he had lived, evading accountability. Kim Jong-il. North Korea's official mythology held that Kim Jong-il had been born on a sacred mountain during a double rainbow, that his birth caused a new star to appear in the sky, and that when he first played golf, he scored 11 holes in one. He never had to use the bathroom. He could control the weather with his moods. The reality was a small man in his late 60s, traveling by armored train across his frozen country, when he died of a heart attack on December 17, 2011. Under his leadership, the country suffered a catastrophic famine in the late 1990s that killed an estimated 500,000 to 1 million North Koreans, while his personal lifestyle remained lavish. He maintained a network of prison camps where hundreds of thousands were worked, starved, and executed. North Korean state media did not announce his death for 51 hours. When the announcement finally came on December 19th, anchor Ri Chun-hee appeared on television dressed in black, weeping. The footage that followed showed citizens collapsing in the streets, screaming, tearing at their hair. Whether those scenes were genuine grief or performances enforced by fear, observers outside the country could not fully determine. In North Korea, the wrong facial expression could send a family to a prison camp. Kim Jong-il's embalmed body was placed on display in a glass mausoleum in Pyongyang. Power passed to his 27-year-old son, Kim Jong-un, without disruption. The dynasty continued. Joseph Stalin. Of all the endings in this video, Stalin's may be the most darkly poetic. The man who ruled the Soviet Union for nearly 3 decades through mass executions, gulags, forced collectivization, and a terror so pervasive that a single denunciation could send a person to Siberia, died alone on the floor of his own bedroom, lying in his own urine for over 12 hours because his guards were too frightened to check on him. On the evening of March 1st, 1953, Stalin hosted his usual late-night dinner at his dacha near Moscow. His inner circle attended, men who smiled and drank and lived in permanent, quiet terror of the man at the head of the table. After dinner, Stalin retired to his quarters. Hours passed. No summons came. Entering without being called was the kind of thing that could get a person arrested, or worse. The guards waited. Morning came, afternoon, still nothing. By evening, one guard finally looked inside. Stalin was found on the floor beside his bed, partially paralyzed, unable to speak. He had suffered a massive stroke, possibly many hours earlier. Stalin lingered for 4 days. He died on March 5, 1953, at 9:50 p.m. He was 74. His death triggered public mourning so intense that the crowd surging through Moscow to pay respects caused a stampede that killed hundreds of people. Irony rarely reaches that far. And privately? The men who had lived in terror of him, they breathed easier. The system of fear that Stalin had built so carefully had, in the end, made it impossible for anyone to save him. Mao's Great Leap Forward. A brief note on scale, because numbers alone fail to capture it. Between 1959 and 1961, Mao's Great Leap Forward, a campaign to rapidly industrialize China by forcing rural populations into agricultural communes, caused the largest famine in recorded human history. Scholars estimate that between 15 million and 55 million people died, not from war, not from an enemy invasion, from policy decisions made in Beijing. Peasants who failed to meet grain quotas were beaten or denied food. Farmers who attempted to flee were stopped at provincial borders. Local officials, terrified of reporting failure upward, falsified production numbers, and those false numbers meant grain was exported while people starved. Mao was informed of the famine. He continued the policies for years. He died in 1976, in his bed, having never been held accountable for a single death. If you've ever wondered why historians debate who was the most destructive individual in human history, now you have some context. Power is never permanent. Every one of these men believed, at some point, that they had made themselves untouchable. They had armies, secret police, propaganda machines, and the absolute authority of life and death over millions, and yet each of them fell. Some were pulled from hiding holes and executed. Some wasted away in hospital beds, dodging justice to the last breath. Some died in the same manner they had used against others, sudden, violent, undignified. History has a long memory, and it is not kind. If you want more videos like this, subscribe, and drop your suggestions in the comments for who we should cover next.